Tonight, we begin with some of the worst people the Middle Ages ever unleashed on the world. Outlaws, murderers, and walking catastrophes who somehow lived long enough to earn a footnote in history. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange corner of historical storytelling. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's slowly sink into tonight's dark, muddy journey through history. If you think your own career path has been unpredictable, allow me to introduce Eustace the Monk. He began life as a Benedictine cleric and somehow ended up as a pirate, so irritating that both England and France repeatedly tried to kill him. Born around 1170 in northern France, Eustace entered a monastery in search of peace, humility, and spiritual fulfillment. All noble goals, right up until you discover you hate them. After a few years of prayer, silence, and institutional porridge, Eustace decided he preferred excitement, preferably the kind that involved arson. He left the monastery, robbed a few people, burned a few houses, and confidently announced that God had called him to a life of adventure. Whether God returned the call remains unclear. Somewhere along the way, Eustace picked a fight with a nobleman named Renaud de Dammartin. What began as insults escalated into full-scale arson with impressive speed. Faster than you can say, "Forgive us our trespasses." After losing his lands, Eustace turned to piracy. Because if you can't win on land, stealing other people's ships is always an option. From that moment on, he became one of the most unpredictable men to ever terrorize the Channel. One year, he was raiding French coastlines on behalf of King John of England. The next, he was happily attacking English ships for the French. Essentially, Eustace was a one-man medieval NATO crisis. Chroniclers described him as a master of disguise who could vanish into thin air, which probably just meant he was very good at fleeing into fog. He also claimed to have studied black magic, which in medieval terms usually meant he knew how to lie convincingly and get away with it. Supposedly, he could summon storms and control the wind, though in reality, he probably just waited for bad weather and took credit. In 1217, Eustace's luck ran out at the Battle of Sandwich when the English caught him on his ship. He offered to pay ransom, which is adorable considering how much he'd already stolen. The English politely declined and cut off his head. They displayed it on the mast, which in the 13th century counted as both closure and interior decoration. To the French, he was a patriotic rogue. To the English, a demonic pest. To everyone else, he was proof that sometimes quitting the monastery isn't personal growth. It's just the start of a new crime spree. In the 14th century, Ireland didn't have many celebrities, but it did have Alice Kittler, who managed to become famous, rich, and accused of witchcraft, all before her fourth husband mysteriously died. Some people leave behind a legacy of good deeds. Alice left behind a trail of corpses and unanswered questions. She was born into money, married into more, and quickly realized that being a medieval woman with a functioning brain was suspicious enough. But when all four of her husbands died under what polite society called peculiar circumstances, that suspicion escalated into full-blown hysteria. The town of Kilkenny decided she was either a serial widow with terrible luck or a witch with excellent aim. According to the official charges, Alice had a personal demon named Robin Artisan who appeared as a black dog, a shadowy man, or possibly just a convenient excuse. She was accused of poisoning her husbands with powders, ointments, and unholy herbs, which sounds like witchcraft, but could also describe medieval medicine. Witnesses swore she sacrificed animals, chanted Latin backwards, and held secret parties with her coven. In other words, she was doing what everyone else in Kilkenny did on weekends, just with better marketing. The local bishop, Richard Dedria, launched a moral crusade against her because nothing says holy man like obsessively chasing a woman with money. Alice, being smart, immediately fled to England before anyone could light a torch. Her servant, Petronilla Death, wasn't so lucky. She was flogged, tortured, and burned alive, becoming Ireland's first recorded witch burning, and a grim reminder that medieval equality had a very specific ceiling. Alice vanished after that, never seen again. Some say she lived out her days in England. Others claim she fled to Flanders. And one theory insists she married again, which if true proves she either had incredible confidence or an unstoppable hobby. Whether she was guilty or not doesn't really matter. In medieval Europe, wealth, independence, and an above-average survival rate were already witchcraft. Alice Kittler's real crime wasn't sorcery. It was outsmarting the system long enough to get away with it. And that in the Middle Ages was practically supernatural. If you ever needed proof that medieval nobility was a bad mix of power and untreated insanity, look no further than Jill D. France's wealthiest war hero turned full-time psychopath. Born in 1405, Guile was everything the Middle Ages loved in a man. Noble blood, military talent, and a castle large enough to require its own postal code. He fought alongside Joan of Arc, the teenage visionary who made grown men cry, and the English reconsider their life choices. Gil was her loyal companion, brave, devout, and probably the only man in 15th century France who showered twice a year voluntarily. But after Joan's execution, something inside him broke. Maybe it was grief, guilt, or just a deeply suppressed flair for chaos. He retired from war, built a theater in his castle, and started staging bizarre plays featuring angels, demons, and himself in every starring role. From there, things went downhill fast, and by downhill, we mean directly into the abyss. Gus surrounded himself with alchemists, astrologers, and other people who promised wealth in exchange for a few ingredients. Unfortunately, one of those ingredients was often human. Rumors spread that he was kidnapping children from nearby villages, hundreds, according to court records. Witnesses described rituals, candles, strange chants, and Jill losing his temper whenever gold failed to appear. Basically, a medieval cryptocurrency experiment gone horribly wrong. When the church finally took notice, Gil was arrested and interrogated. Though in fairness, interrogation in the 15th century involved less conversation and more persuasion with hot irons. He confessed to everything: murder, sorcery, and poor life choices. Historians still debate how much was real and how much was extracted via creative questioning. But even by medieval standards, his reputation was beyond salvageable. In 1440, Gilday was hanged, burned, and half-heartedly forgiven. Some called him France's first serial killer. Others said he was a scapegoat for noble corruption. Either way, you can't go from fighting beside a saint to ending up on the church's do not invite to dinner list without earning it. His castles crumbled, his name was erased, and his legend lingered. A man who started as a hero, died as a monster, and still managed to make nobility look worse than usual. Before Robin Hood was stealing from the rich and handing out questionable economics lessons, there was Hereward the Wake, England's original outlaw hero. Except unlike Robin, Hereward wasn't charming, generous, or even particularly polite. He was just furious. And honestly, who could blame him? Born around 1035, Hereward was a Saxon noble who didn't take kindly to William the Conqueror's whole invade England and replace everyone plan. When the Normans showed up in 1066, most Saxons submitted, shaved their heads, and learned to say we, not Hereward. He looked at the new foreign rulers, looked at his confiscated lands, and decided passive aggression wasn't enough. He gathered a band of fellow exiles and declared war on basically everyone with a French accent. From the marshy region of Ely, he led raids on Norman garrisons, burned villages, ambushed knights, and occasionally liberated monasteries, by which we mean he robbed them blind and called it divine redistribution. His nickname, the Wake, probably meant the watchful, though it might also describe the constant stream of destruction left behind him. Chroniclers alternated between calling him a patriotic freedom fighter and a dangerous lunatic. Both are accurate. Hereward's greatest moment came when the Normans tried to invade Ely by building causeways through the swamp. He let them get halfway across, then set the whole thing on fire. Imagine the look on a Norman knight's face as he sinks into a burning bog. It's practically medieval performance art. For a while, Hereward was unstoppable, the mud-drenched menace of Anglo-Saxon revenge. But rebellions, like medieval plumbing, rarely ended well. Eventually, the Normans bribed his allies, overran his base, and forced him to flee. Accounts differ on how he died. Some say he was killed by bounty hunters. Others claim he lived quietly, plotting one last ambush that never came. Either way, his legend outlived him. To the English, he became the symbol of resistance, the man who refused to bow. To the Normans, he was the bogeyman parents used to scare their children. And to historians, he's a reminder that being the last honest Saxon is a noble title. Right up until someone invents gunpowder, Scotland has given the world many things. Whiskey, bagpipes, and an unshakable reputation for bad weather. But somewhere in the damp 15th century, it allegedly produced Sonny Bean, a man so horrifying that even medieval chroniclers wrote about him with the tone of, "We honestly hope this isn't true." The story goes that Sonny Bean left home after deciding that honest work was beneath him, a sentiment shared by most aristocrats of the time. With his equally questionable wife, he settled in a coastal cave nearer, a location chosen for its convenient isolation and complete lack of witnesses. There, the pair began what can only be described as the worst family business in Scottish history: robbing and eating travelers. Over the years, they allegedly produced a brood of children and grandchildren, 48 in total, who all shared two things: a love of meat and an aversion to sunlight. The Beans ambushed travelers along lonely roads, looted their belongings, and brought the bodies back to their cave for storage. Picture a medieval Costco, but everything's human and it smells worse. The clan lived this way for decades, undetected, feasting on the occasional tourist and decorating their home with what historians tactfully call remains. Eventually, suspicion grew when entire groups of travelers started disappearing. Locals blamed witches, wild beasts, and foreigners, the usual suspects, until one victim escaped and led authorities straight to the Bean family buffet. When the search party entered the cave, they reportedly found barrels of salted human flesh, piles of bones, and enough limbs to open a small museum. The Beans were captured and taken to Edinburgh, where King James himself supposedly ordered their immediate execution. No trials, no mercy, just medieval efficiency. The men were dismembered alive. The women and children followed soon after. Just as 15th century style, horrifying, effective, and slightly overcooked. Modern historians suspect the whole thing might be exaggerated or even entirely fabricated. Medieval Scotland wasn't exactly known for its investigative journalism. Still, the legend of Sane Bean endures because nothing captures the human imagination quite like an entire family choosing cannibalism over a 9-to-5 job. Whether he existed or not, Sonny Bean remains the most terrifying reminder that sometimes the real monster isn't in the castle. It's living rent-free in a cave by the sea. If you thought the Middle Ages were chaotic enough, imagine adding organized crime into the mix. Not the flashy kind with suits and cigars, but one run by people who smelled like turnips and carried knives made from farm tools. Welcome to the Thieves' Guild, the medieval version of corporate networking for people who preferred pickpocketing to productivity. In most medieval cities, crime wasn't just tolerated. It was practically a career path. You could be a mason, a tanner, or if you had nimble fingers and a flexible sense of morality, a thief. The guilds of craftsmen had apprenticeships, training, and codes of conduct. And so did the thieves. In London, Paris, and Venice, thieves formed loose organizations where skills were passed down like family recipes. One pinch of stealth, one distraction, and a quick exit through the nearest sewer. They even had initiation rituals. New recruits swore loyalty, learned hand signals, and occasionally cut purses from dummies before moving on to actual people. In Paris, these groups were known as the Cockyards, while in England, they operated out of city slums like Southwark, the kind of neighborhood where even the rats locked their doors at night. Authorities knew about them, of course, but medieval law enforcement was inconsistent. Constables were unpaid, corrupt, or asleep. And prisons were so unsanitary that most criminals preferred getting caught in winter just for the indoor heating. In some cases, officials struck deals with thieves, collecting taxes in exchange for looking the other way. Yes, medieval police protection rackets were a real thing. But make no mistake, the Thieves' Guild wasn't all romance and rebellion. It was brutal business. Disobedient members were punished harshly, often by losing a hand. Ironic, considering the hand was their main tool of trade. And if you betrayed your guild, you disappeared faster than a merchant's coin purse on market day. Still, they thrived. In a world obsessed with hierarchy and privilege, the guilds gave common criminals a strange sort of dignity. Thievery became an art, and survival itself a profession. In short, if you ever find yourself time traveling to the Middle Ages, keep one hand on your wallet. And if someone bumps into you twice, congratulations. You've just contributed to a centuries-old economy. The 18th century was a strange time. Not quite medieval anymore, but still dirty enough to qualify spiritually. And in this murky in-between age rode Dick Turpin, England's most famous highwayman, a man whose reputation galloped far faster than his actual horse ever did. Turpin was born around 1705 to a butcher's family, which should have been a stable, respectable trade. But Turpin preferred taking meat the quick way from other people. He started out stealing cattle, then horses, and eventually realized that robbing people directly was much less paperwork. Thus began his illustrious career as a highwayman, the medieval version of a mugger, but with better fashion sense. He wasn't alone. The roads around London were crawling with ambitious criminals, each convinced they were God's gift to organized theft. Turpin stood out because he understood branding. He dressed well, spoke politely, and had a flair for drama. Victims reported being robbed with great civility, which, to be fair, was more courtesy than they'd get from the tax collector. Soon, pamphlets and newspapers began romanticizing him as a gentleman bandit. Plays were written about his daring escapes, especially one where he allegedly rode his horse Black Bess from London to York, nearly 200 miles in a single night. It's a great story, but entirely fictional. The real Turpin couldn't ride that far without stopping for a drink, a robbery, and possibly another drink. Behind the myth, Turpin was less charming. He was violent, crude, and not exactly loyal to his friends. After one robbery went wrong, he shot a man for recognizing him, fled north, and started living under the fake name John Palmer, which would have worked better if he hadn't immediately started stealing horses again. His downfall came when he left a letter to his brother and forgot to pay hostage. The postmaster recognized his handwriting because apparently Turpin was the only criminal in Yorkshire who wrote like a poet. He was arrested, tried, and hanged in 1739 before a cheering crowd. Ever the showman, he bowed to the audience before the rope snapped, proving that even in death, Dick Turpin never missed his curtain call. His legend lives on, polished by centuries of bad history and good storytelling. The real Turpin was no gentleman, just a thief who happened to look good on paper. If the phrase holy warrior sounds like a contradiction, meet from morale, the monk who turned salvation into a side hustle and war into a full-time subscription plan. Born around 1310 in Provence, from Moriel, real name Montreal d'Albano, joined the Order of the Knights Hospital, a religious brotherhood dedicated to healing the sick, protecting pilgrims, and occasionally stabbing anyone who didn't agree with them. He took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and then, like so many monks with ambition, decided all three were negotiable. After a few years of holy work, Moriel realized the world offered better pay outside the monastery. So he reinvented himself as a condiero, a mercenary commander in Italy, because nothing says devotion like selling your sword to the highest bidder. Italy in the 14th century was a buffet of conflict. City-states, popes, and petty lords all fighting over who had the fanciest banners. Morel fit right in. He founded the Great Company, a gang of professional soldiers so large it could conquer small countries. They fought for whoever paid them most, and when no one paid them, they fought anyway. They looted villages, held cities for ransom, and treated neutrality as a temporary medical condition. Morel's army even sacked the Papal States at one point, which didn't do wonders for his resume in heaven. He became fabulously rich, buying castles, gold, and according to one chronicler, a bed fit for a cardinal and morals to match. His soldiers admired him, civilians feared him, and nobles reluctantly admitted that his invoices were always accurate. But like all men who confuse luck for divine approval, Morel pushed too far. By 1354, his greed had alienated everyone, including the Pope. He was captured in Rome and executed by order of the Senate, who in a rare burst of efficiency killed him before he could bribe them. His body was thrown into the street where the locals celebrated by looting his corpse. Irony, Medieval Edition. Framrel's story is proof that you can take the man out of the monastery, but you can't take the monk out of moral bankruptcy. He died as he lived loudly, profitably, and just slightly off script from the Bible. In 15th century France, long before the Mafia or MI6, there was a shadowy organization known as the Coquillards, a criminal network so sophisticated it could have written a PowerPoint on medieval corruption for beginners. They operated mostly in Dijon, Burgundy, the kind of place where half the citizens were drunk. The other half were plotting, and everyone was related. The Coquillards weren't simple pickpockets. They were professionals, con artists, and master impersonators. If there was a coin to steal, a letter to forge, or a gullible noble to charm, they were already 3 steps ahead. Their name, Coquillards, came from the word for shell, a reference to the scallop shell worn by pilgrims. They'd pose as pious travelers returning from Santiago to Compostela, spouting religious jargon while quietly robbing their hosts blind. Think of them as medieval influences. All image, no accountability. They spoke their own coded language, a secret argot filled with slang, symbols, and sarcasm. This wasn't just street talk. It was a full-blown subculture. A thief might call a purse, a fish, a knife, a light, and an arrest. A misfortune from God's left hand. The goal was to confuse everyone except your accomplices. And it worked beautifully. Even the court transcript from their trials read like riddles written by people who'd smoked questionable herbs. The Coquillards specialized in fraud. They sold fake relics, a booming business in a country obsessed with saintly finger bones, wrote counterfeit documents, and ran traveling scams where one thief distracted a crowd while another relieved them of their belongings. On slow days, they forged royal seals, a risky but profitable way to turn parchment into profit. Their downfall came when local authorities realized that an entire town was being outsmarted by men in stolen robes. The Duke of Burgundy launched a crackdown, arresting dozens. The trials were bizarrely theatrical. Some thieves defended themselves in flawless Latin, which was probably more shocking than the crimes. A few were executed, others disappeared, and the rest simply renamed the guild and carried on. Though officially erased, the Coquillards never really died. They just evolved into every scam, grift, and Ponzi scheme that came after. In a way, they were pioneers, not of honesty or morality, but of the timeless human dream, making money without actually working for it. If the Mediterranean had its glamorous pirates with earrings and poetry, the Baltic Sea got the opposite. Frostbitten psychopaths who smelled like fish and despair. Meet the Hanseatic pirates, also known as the Vitalian Brooder, or in less romantic English, the Victual Brothers. Yes, they were named after food. Nothing strikes fear into sailors like being boarded by men called the Snack Squad. The battalion Brooder began with good intentions, always a red flag. Around the late 14th century, the Duke of Mecklenburg hired them to deliver supplies, victuals, to Stockholm, which was under siege by the Danes. The pirates did their job, got paid, and then, as every mercenary does eventually, realized crime was far more fun than employment. Soon they stopped delivering supplies and started stealing everything that floated. They raided merchant ships, kidnapped crews, and held coastal towns for ransom. The Hanseatic League, a network of medieval trade cities that basically ran Northern Europe like a corporation, tried to stop them, but the pirates were too good at their jobs. Their motto allegedly was God's friends and the whole world's enemies, which doubles as a perfect Twitter bio. They didn't just rob ships, they disrupted economies. Grain prices skyrocketed, trade collapsed, and entire cities started paying them protection money. Imagine being extorted by men who couldn't spell extortion. Their base was the island of Gotland, which they turned into a pirate republic, complete with taverns, loot markets, and presumably some of the worst seafood in history. By the early 1400s, they had become the medieval version of organized chaos, plundering one day, selling stolen goods to bishops the next. Even the Teutonic Knights tried to fight them, which went about as well as you'd expect. Holy men in heavy armor versus drunk sailors with axes. Eventually, the Hanseatic League united its fleets and crushed the pirates in a series of naval battles. Those captured were executed publicly, not because of moral outrage, but because the merchants were tired of explaining insurance claims. Still, the legend of the sea wolves endured. They were cruel, cunning, and occasionally patriotic if the paycheck was right. In the end, they proved what every empire eventually learns. If you feed pirates long enough, they stop delivering and start dining on you instead. If medieval Germany had Netflix, Peter Nars would have had his own true crime docu-series, probably titled Witchcraft, Murder, and Bad Life Choices. Born sometime in the 16th century, Noah was a wandering bandit who took career criminal to disturbing new heights. He started small, highway robbery, theft, the occasional stabbing, but quickly realized the competition was fierce. So like any good entrepreneur, he diversified. His new niche, satanic serial murder, because apparently medieval crime had a marketing department. Contemporary pamphlets claim Nias murdered over 500 people, including pregnant women whose unborn children he supposedly used for dark rituals. The number alone is ridiculous. He would have needed an HR department to manage that workload. But the fear he inspired was very real. He allegedly carried a bag filled with magical items, including unborn hearts, candles made of human fat, and probably a few regrettable lunch leftovers. Locals swore he could shape-shift, turning into animals to escape capture, which sounds absurd until you remember that medieval Europe thought frogs were morally suspicious. The church and state launched massive hunts for him, but Nars was slippery. He had sympathizers everywhere, innkeepers, beggars, fellow bandits, and bribed them with stolen goods. To many peasants, he was both terrifying and impressive. A man who defied all laws, human and divine, and managed not to die immediately. But crime, like medieval plumbing, always ends badly. In 1577, N was captured once and escaped. The authorities were so embarrassed they executed his accomplices twice, just to be sure. He vanished again, only to resurface years later when a local innkeeper noticed his bag of suspicious contents. Word spread fast, and within hours the most wanted man in Europe was arrested while trying to enjoy a quiet meal. His execution was designed for maximum discomfort. He was tortured for 2 days, broken on the wheel, and finally dismembered, a method medieval bureaucrats considered thorough closure. The crowd reportedly cheered, partly out of justice, and partly because in 1581 public execution was the best entertainment available. Whether he was truly a black magician or just a violent lunatic, Peter remains medieval Europe's worst resume. A man so evil they needed 2 religions and 3 torture devices to make sure he stopped existing. Every so often the Middle Ages produced a man who looked around at the mud, hunger, and taxes and said, "You know what? No." One such man was Robert of Recedale, an English rebel who proved that if life gives you feudalism, you can at least set it on fire. It was the summer of 1469, and England was halfway through the Wars of the Roses, a long-running family argument about who got to sit on the throne and ruin the economy next. While nobles slaughtered each other in decorative armor, peasants were left broke, hungry, and one tax away from revolution. Enter Robert. Historians don't agree on who he really was. Some say he was a disgruntled knight, others a common soldier, and one chronicler simply described him as an angry man with influence, which could also describe most of medieval England. Whatever his origins, Robert rallied thousands of peasants, farmers, and minor gentry under his banner, not with promises of liberty and justice, but with something far more powerful: revenge on the people who overcharged them for bread. The rebellion of Redesdale swept through northern England like a bad rumor. Castles were raided, manors burned, and officials were dragged out of their homes for the medieval equivalent of a performance review. Robert's army marched south, shouting slogans about reform, though it's likely most of them just wanted lunch and to see London once before dying. At first, it worked. Local lords panicked. The royal court trembled. Then, as with all medieval rebellions, reality arrived in the form of a professional army that didn't find peasant enthusiasm particularly intimidating. Robert's forces were crushed in a matter of days. Survivors were hanged, villages punished, and history went back to being written by people who didn't need a farm. Robert himself vanished, executed, assassinated, or maybe just melted into the countryside like the mud he came from. His name lived on mostly in warnings about the dangers of letting peasants think too much. Still, his rebellion left a mark. It showed that even in the rigid, God-ordained hierarchy of medieval England, There were limits to how much exploitation one man or one village could take. Robert didn't win, but he did what few dared. He reminded kings that pitchforks count as weapons, too. Before James Bond, before the Mafia, before your favorite Netflix anti-hero, there were the Assassins of Alamut, a group so mysterious and terrifying that their name became a permanent addition to the human vocabulary. Today, assassin means killer. Back then, it meant people who could make a king sleep badly for the rest of his life. The story begins in 11th century Persia, where a brilliant and stubborn man named Hassan-i Sabah decided that the Muslim world needed more discipline, more order, and far fewer people who disagreed with him. He founded a breakaway sect of Ismaili Muslims and seized a fortress in northern Iran called Alamut, a stone eagle's nest perched high in the mountains. From there, he created one of the most feared secret societies in history. The group's enemies called them the Hashishin, claiming they use hashish before missions, a slanderous detail most likely invented by people who didn't appreciate getting stabbed in public. In reality, the assassins weren't mindless zealots. They were professionals, quiet, educated, and patient. Their specialty, political murder, so surgical that entire wars changed course after one dagger. They infiltrated palaces disguised as servants, scribes, or occasionally enthusiastic gardeners. Then, when the time was right, they'd strike, clean, quick, and usually in front of an audience to make a point. Kings, generals, caifs, and even crusader lords learned to check their food, their wine, and their bedchambers twice. A few got paranoid enough to start sleeping in towers surrounded by mows and guards, which worked beautifully right up until someone bribed the guards. The assassins never had large armies, but they didn't need them. Fear did most of their work. One well-placed killing could halt invasions, rewrite treaties, or encourage a ruler to suddenly rediscover humility. Even the mighty Saladin, conqueror of Jerusalem, nearly joined their target list twice. Eventually, their fortress was destroyed by the Mongols in the 13th century because nothing survives a Mongol invasion. Not cities, not walls, not even secret mountain cults. But their legend refused to die. The word assassin spread west with the Crusaders and into every language on earth. And though the men of Alamut vanished centuries ago, their message remained timeless. Sometimes the sharpest political argument is a very small, very well-placed knife. If you lived in medieval London and still had your money by sundown, congratulations. You just beaten the city's most popular sport, not getting robbed. Because long before bankers invented creative theft, there were the cut purses, the silent professionals who turned pickpocketing into an Olympic event. London in the Middle Ages was crowded, chaotic, and profoundly sticky. Narrow streets crammed with markets, pilgrims, prostitutes, and goats created the perfect ecosystem for petty crime. While preachers warned of sin, the cut purses quietly relieved them of their collection coins. They didn't mug or stab. That was amateur work. A good cut purse was an artist. The blade had to be sharp, the hand steady, and the timing perfect. The name says it all. These thieves literally cut the strings on your coin pouch. A single slice, and the purse vanished into the crowd. Some worked alone, others teamed up. One would bump you in the market, another would accidentally distract you with a sermon on salvation. And by the time you said amen, your week's wages had gone to hell. Apprentices learned their trade the same way as blacksmiths or bakers. A young thief would train under a master, practicing on dummies, or more likely drunkards. Success required a calm demeanor and absolutely no conscience. Medieval law punished theft brutally, but public hangings were so common that thieves treated them as networking events. If your mentor got executed, you inherited his customers. And it wasn't just men. London's female cut purses were legends in their own right, often posing as flower sellers, laundry girls, or repentant sinners. One 18th-century woman named Nan Hackett reportedly worked church aisles during Mass, specializing in noble women who closed their eyes too long during prayer. The authorities knew what was happening, but were often in on it. Sheriffs, judges, and guards all took their cuts, sometimes literally. For every thief dangling from a gallows, 3 more were plying their trade in the crowd below. Over time, the word cut purse became a cultural insult, a way to describe anyone morally flexible, from pickpockets to politicians. And honestly, little has changed. Modern London may have fewer pouches and more pockets, but the spirit of the cup purse lives on, usually behind a screen, in customer service, or at your bank. When you hear the name Vlad the Impaler, you probably think of the vampire myth, brooding castles, bats, and a mild drinking problem. The truth is much simpler. Vlad didn't drink blood. He spilled it efficiently in bulk and with terrifying administrative consistency. Born in 1431 in Transylvania, Vlad of Wallachia inherited a small principality wedged between the Ottoman Empire and Hungary, two countries that treated Wallachia less like a nation and more like a chew toy. His father, Vlad Dracul, had joined a knightly order called the Order of the Dragon, which sounds noble, but was really just a medieval HOA for men with swords and anger issues. Vlad Jr. inherited the name Dracula, meaning son of the dragon, and took it a bit too literally. As a young prince, he spent years as a political hostage under the Ottomans, where he learned diplomacy, military strategy, and how much he hated everyone. When he finally reclaimed his throne in 1456, he decided to fix his country's crime problem by making punishments slightly worse than the crimes. His preferred method, impalement, the subtle art of inserting a wooden stake through the body and leaving the victim to contemplate their life choices until gravity took over. Thieves, liars, ambassadors, and even ungrateful dinner guests all faced the same fate. Foreign envoys who refused to remove their hats before him were nailed to their own skulls, which admittedly settled the etiquette debate quickly. When the Ottomans invaded, Vlad reportedly impaled 20,000 prisoners outside the capital as a warning. The invaders' turnaround. Honestly, who wouldn't? To his subjects, he was both protector and nightmare. Crime vanished, partly due to fear, partly because half the population was decorating the countryside. Merchants could leave gold on the street overnight and find it untouched in the morning, assuming they didn't mind the smell. Vlad was eventually captured by the Hungarians, released, and then killed in battle. His head was sent to the Sultan in a jar of honey because even medieval villains appreciated presentation. Centuries later, Bram Stoker turned him into Count Dracula, making him immortal in a far less sticky way. But the truth remains. Vlad the Impaler wasn't a monster of myth. He was something rarer, a man so committed to law and order that he made hell look like a management seminar. Babylon, June 323 BC. The air is thick with heat and the smell of roasted meat, incense, and ambition. Alexander the Great, the man who had crossed deserts, stormed cities, and bent empires to his will, sits at the head of a long marble table. Around him, his generals laugh too loudly and drink too much, their laughter masking exhaustion and quiet fear. The feast is meant to celebrate plans for a new campaign into Arabia, but it feels more like a man daring the gods to notice him one last time. He's 32 years old and undefeated in battle, yet his body shows the toll of conquest. Scars crawl across his arms like faint white lightning. His voice isoaro, his eyes bloodshot from weeks of drinking and little sleep. But he's still Alexander. And in Babylon, that means no one dares to look away when he raises a cup. Another toast. He commands, and the room obeys. He drinks deeply, wine mixed with water, honey, and perhaps something else. The cup clatters back to the table. For a moment, his face tightens. He waves it off with a laugh. The great king who once marched through Persian palaces now struggles to stand from his own table. Some say it began there, a sudden pain, a fire in his belly that would not go out. Others claim he was struck by fever days earlier while inspecting the canals near the Euphrates. But among his inner circle, whispers begin to form like cracks in marble. Cassander, Anaparta's son, had every reason to want him dead. Others had been humiliated, pushed aside, terrified that Alexander's plans to be worshipped as a god would destroy what was left of their fragile loyalties. That night, the music grows louder to drown the tension. Wine flows like the river outside Babylon's gates. The torches burn low, painting the marble walls in flickering gold. And somewhere between laughter and delirium, the conqueror of the world begins to shiver. No one yet dares to say it aloud, but something irreversible has started. The man who never lost a battle, may have just lost a fight his sword could not win. One that began with a single drink at Babylon. The morning after the banquet, Babylon stirs under a punishing sun. The palace servants whisper, "The king has fallen ill." At first, it seems harmless enough. Alexander has endured worse. He survived arrow wounds, lung infections, and the kind of exhaustion that kills ordinary men. A little fever. That's nothing, or so they think. He wakes drenched in sweat, his body trembling as though the whole empire inside him was shaking apart. When attendants offer him wine, he waves it away, muttering that it burns his throat. His generals come to visit Tommy, Perdiccas, and Nos, men who had followed him through deserts and rivers of blood. They find him pale, voice thin, yet still insisting on military reports. Even half delirious, he talks of troop formations and fleet construction, as if death itself were just another city to besiege. But the fever climbs higher. Within hours, he's unable to rise from bed. His commanders whisper in the corridors, trying to mass panic with politics. Was it malaria from the marshes near the Euphrates? Typhoid from contaminated water? Or something far less natural? Poison slipped into the crater by a trembling hand the night before. Babylon is full of suspects and full of fear. Days pass. The fever worsens. His breath grows ragged, his speech slurred. The same man who once ran beside his troops, shouting orders with unbreakable clarity, now struggles to form words. The royal physicians are summoned, their hands shaking as they press cold cloths to his forehead. Some recommend purging, others prayer. None dare admit they are powerless. Still, Alexander refuses to believe his body has betrayed him. "I'll recover," he rasps, as if saying it aloud could make it true. He asks for his armor, demands to see his soldiers, but can't even lift his head. Each day, the rumor spreads further. The king is dying. The streets outside the palace fill with uneasy crowds, soldiers clutching their spears, servants crossing themselves against evil spirits. Inside his chamber, Babylon's greatest conqueror lies burning with fever, whispering plans to invade Arabia, even as his strength drains away. The man who had faced armies without fear now faces his final unseen enemy. One no spear can pierce, and no strategy can outwit. By the fifth day, Babylon's royal palace feels less like the seat of an empire and more like a tomb waiting to be sealed. The once bustling halls have gone eerily quiet. Servants move in silence, guards whisper, and courtiers trade glances heavy with dread. The doctors come and go like ghosts, their eyes avoiding the generals. They've run out of explanations or courage. Alexander's fever has not broken. His skin glows with a sickly sheen, and his breathing is shallow. Each gasp a small rebellion against whatever force has taken hold of him. His commanders, Tommy, Seleucus, and Perdiccas, gather in the antechamber, pretending to discuss military logistics. In truth, they're already calculating the impossible question. Who rules the world when Alexander doesn't? No one dares to ask it aloud, but ambition has begun to stir beneath the sorrow. Babylon hums with concealed treachery. Every man in that chamber has dreamed at least once of wearing the crown, or at least holding a piece of the empire it represents. The longer Alexander lingers between life and death, the more dangerous the silence becomes. The king's voice, once loud enough to command thousands, is now barely a whisper. "Will I recover?" he asks the physicians. They bow, mutter assurances they don't believe, and flee the room as quickly as they entered. By evening, the corridors are filled with murmurs. Some claim the gods are punishing him for calling himself divine. Others whisper darker things. That poison, not plague, is to blame. Names are thrown around like daggers. Antipater, Cassandra, Iolus, even Aristotle, his old teacher, rumored to have provided the fatal recipe. Outside, soldiers kneel before the palace gates, praying for the health of their king. They followed him from Macedonia to India, across deserts and over mountains, believing he was untouchable. Now, for the first time, they sense the truth. He's mortal. That night, Babylon doesn't sleep. Torches burn low, casting long shadows over marble floors and terrified men. Inside the king's chamber, the sound of dripping water echoes softly, marking the hours. The physicians can do nothing but watch. The silence of the palace deepens, heavy and absolute, as if even the gods are holding their breath. By the seventh day, The fever has turned Alexander's chamber into a battlefield of whispers. His body lies motionless on a silk-draped bed, but his empire, from Greece to India, trembles on invisible fault lines. The generals gather daily at the palace, pretending to seek updates on his condition while secretly waging a different war, the one for succession. Perdiccas, the loyal lieutenant, claims he is only following Alexander's last commands, yet his eyes reveal calculation. Tommy, calm and smiling, masks ambition behind diplomacy. Seleucus stands silent, watching everyone, as if already measuring how long each man would last without a king to obey. The room reeks of incense, sweat, and deceit. The questioner at them all: who inherits an empire built around one man's will? Alexander has no legitimate heir. His wife Roxana is pregnant, but the child's fate is uncertain. Some whisper that Heracles, his illegitimate son, could be proclaimed king. Others murmur that the generals should divide the realm, an idea that sounds like blasphemy, but tastes like freedom. Outside the sick room, Babylon's courtyards buzz with tension. The army waits, restless and suspicious. Macedonian veterans, hardened by decades of conquest, demand to see their commander. They will not take orders from anyone else. They mutter that if Alexander dies, they will choose their own leaders, a promise that chills the generals to their bones. Inside, the air grows staler by the hour. The royal physicians suggest rituals to appease the gods, desperate to look useful. Priests chant beside his bed, fanning the heavy incense smoke. Alexander, half-conscious, murmurs commands, perhaps to his troops, perhaps to shadows. His eyes open occasionally, glazed yet defiant, even dying. He looks like a man about to issue an order that could change the world. The generals watch him, torn between loyalty and fear. They need him to live, but also dread what he'll do if he recovers and learns of their scheming. Every cough, every sigh feels like an omen. By nightfall, they stand in silence at the edge of his bed, pretending to pray. But each man's thoughts are elsewhere, on armies, provinces, and crowns waiting to be seized. In that dimly lit chamber, the world's most powerful men quietly begin to plan for a world without Alexander. By the 8th day, the palace gates can no longer hold back the tide. Thousands of soldiers, sunburned, scarred, and still loyal to the man who led them from Macedon to the edge of India, gather outside, demanding to see their king. Rumors have replaced orders. Some say he's recovering. Others whisper he's already dead and that the generals are hiding it to divide the spoils in secret. Inside, the atmosphere grows unbearable. The scent of rot and burning oils mixes with the heavy perfume mint to mask it. The guards outside Alexander's chamber stand like statues, unsure whether they're protecting their king or guarding his corpse. The generals argue in hushed tones, but their voices still leak through the marble walls. Tommy urges calm. Dicus snaps that the men outside will riot if they aren't given proof of life. At last, they decide to let the army pass. One by one, the soldiers file through the great bronze doors. They come barefoot and unarmed, not as warriors, but as mourners. The line stretches endlessly through the palace courtyard, a living river of grief. Inside the royal chamber, Alexander lies still, his face pale as the linens beneath him. He cannot speak. He cannot move. Yet, as the men enter, something remarkable happens. When each soldier kneels beside the bed, Alexander opens his eyes, just enough to meet theirs. He raises his hand slightly, trembling, but unmistakably alive. A faint smile crosses his lips, half a gesture, half a command. It is enough. The soldiers fall to their knees, some weeping openly. They whisper his name like a prayer. In their minds, he's still invincible, a god in human flesh who merely rests before the next campaign. But to the generals, the sight brings no comfort. They see the truth. The king who conquered the world can barely lift his arm. His strength is gone. His empire's glue, his charisma, his will is evaporating. When the last soldier leaves, silence returns. The army outside chants his name into the night, unaware that the gesture they just witnessed was his final act of command. Inside, the torches flicker. Babylon holds its breath. The vigil has ended. The waiting for death begins. By the 10th day, The heat in Babylon feels unnatural, like the world itself is taken ill. Inside the palace, the air is thick with incense and despair. The greatest conqueror in history lies motionless, his chest rising only slightly with each breath. Around him, his generals, physicians, and servants hover in silence, pretending not to watch for the moment when his body gives out. Alexander's once bright eyes are half closed, pupils dull and unfocused. His lips move, forming words no one can hear. The physicians wet his mouth with water and honey, but he no longer swallows. The fever has hollowed him out, leaving only the echo of a man who once shouted orders above the clash of 1,000 spears. The generals draw close, knowing the end is near, but unwilling to face it. Tommy stands with folded arms, his face set in stone. Pedicus paces like a caged wolf. Seleucus watches quietly, already calculating routes and borders in his mind. A few others whisper prayers to Apollo, Asclepius, even Zeus, any god who might take pity on the man who once believed himself divine. Then at last, the silence breaks. Alexander asks for his soldiers. His voice is barely a rasp, but they understand. Word spreads through the palace, and soon the courtyard fills again. One by one, the veterans who followed him across continents enter the chamber. Some kiss his hand, others simply bow, unable to speak. He gestures faintly toward his generals. A final act of unity, or command no one can tell. Someone leans close and asks who should rule after him. His eyes drift. His breathing slows. The words come out faint, almost lost to the air, to the strongest. A moment later, the hand that once held the fate of nations falls still. The torches flicker as if the gods themselves exhaled. Outside, the chanting soldiers go silent, sensing what has happened before anyone tells them. For a heartbeat, Babylon is utterly still. No war cries, no footsteps, no sound, just the weight of a death too large for one room to contain. The conqueror of the world has taken his final breath, and the world itself seems unsure how to continue without him. When the word spreads, it doesn't travel. It explodes. Babylon erupts in grief and disbelief. Soldiers tear their tunics. Women wail from rooftops and priests rush to the temples to offer sacrifices that feel meaningless now. The greatest man alive, the living God, is dead. And the empire he forged, that impossible patchwork of cultures and loyalties, shudders like a cracked statue. Inside the palace, chaos replaces ceremony. The generals argue in whispers that grow louder with every hour. Who speaks for the king now? Perdiccas demands they wait for official rights. Tommy insists on securing the treasury before looters smell weakness. Others talk of taking Alexander's body back to Macedon, but even that sparks a fight. Babylon has become a war council dressed in mourning clothes. Outside, thousands of soldiers kneel in the dust. Many refuse to believe the news. He cannot die, one mutters. He's Alexander. To them, he is not a man, but an idea. And ideas don't die of fever. They beg to see the body, to touch him, to prove that their god-king still breathes. When the gates finally open, the procession moves like a storm. Torches light the courtyard as the soldiers file in, silent but shaking. The body lies on a riced bier draped in royal silk, the faint scent of embalming oil already in the air. His armor gleams beside him, the same bronze cuirass that had caught the sun at Gaugamela. Some of the veterans collapse to their knees, pounding their fists against the stone. Others whisper his name over and over as though repetition could undo death. Even the elephants kept in the royal stables trumpet mournfully, spooked by the collective anguish. That night, Babylon doesn't sleep. Fires burn along the city walls, 1,000 small suns flickering against the desert sky. The markets are silent, the taverns empty. Every home glows with lamplight. Every face looks toward the palace. For 12 years, Alexander's name had meant victory, destiny, divine favor. Now it means something heavier. Loss. In the echoing streets of Babylon, a single truth settles like dust after battle. No one can rule the world forever, not even Alexander. Death did not end Alexander's wars. It merely changed the battlefield. Within days of his passing, Babylon's marble halls became a chessboard of ambition. The generals who once toasted his victories now plot in the same rooms where his body lies embalmed in honey and emwyrar. His corpse, radiant and eerily lifelike, becomes the most coveted relic on earth, the symbol of authority itself. Whoever possesses it, some whisper, holds the right to rule. Perdiccas, as commander of the royal army, takes charge of the arrangements. He declares that Alexander's body must be returned to Macedonia to rest beside his father, Philip II. The others nod politely while quietly planning theft. Ptolemy, the shrewd Macedonian stationed in Egypt, has other ideas. He believes the body belongs in a new capital, his capital, Alexandria. A dead god makes an excellent foundation for a living city. The golden funeral carriage is unlike anything the world has ever seen. A rolling temple adorned with statues, columns, and a gilded canopy glittering under the sun. It will take months to reach Macedon, and everyone knows there are plenty of opportunities for it to change direction. As the procession departs Babylon, thousands of soldiers march alongside, weeping and silent. But behind them, the empire they fought for begins to unravel. Rival factions arm themselves. Letters are sent in secret. Assassins prepare to ensure one man's funeral becomes another man's coronation. True to form, Ptolemy strikes first. As the funeral procession crosses Syria, his forces intercept it. The guards, realizing they're outnumbered, surrender the cart without bloodshed. Alexander's body is taken to Egypt, not to Macedon, not to his homeland, but to the sands of the Nile. When news reaches Babylon, outrage mingles with resignation. Some call it theft, others call it destiny. After all, Alexander had always admired Egypt, had even been declared the son of Zeus Ammon there. Perhaps, they reason, he wanted to rest where he was worshipped as divine. But for his former generals, the theft is no holy act. It's a declaration of war. The age of Alexander ends not with peace or mourning, but with a scramble for his ghost. The man who united the world in life now divides it in death. In the months after his death, Alexander's empire fractures like glass dropped from Olympus. The unity he'd forced through charisma and conquest collapses under the weight of human greed. His generals, once bound by his brilliance, now carve the world into kingdoms. They call themselves diadochi, successors, but each behaves like a scavenger at a divine feast. Perdiccas claims to rule as regent for Roxana's unborn son, Alexander, but the others do not recognize him. Ptolemy secures Egypt, guarding the stolen body like a holy relic. Antigonus takes Asia. Seleucus eyes Babylon, and Cassander seizes Greece. The empire of one man splinters into rival realms, each dripping with ambition and betrayal. Meanwhile, Alexander's corpse becomes more powerful than any living king. Ptolemy installs in Memphis, then later moves it to a marble tomb in Alexandria, where pilgrims line up to see the man who once called himself the son of Zeus. Over the years, the tomb becomes a shrine, a political symbol, and eventually a mystery. Its exact location vanishes from record, as if even death refused to pin him down. Stories begin to spread like wildfire. Some say Alexander never truly died, that he ascended to the gods who fathered him. Others claim his body refused to decay, proof of divine favor. Poets sing of his exploits, painting him as both conqueror and saint, tyrant and visionary. To the Greeks, he is Achilles reborn. To the Persians, a cursed destroyer. To later generations, a myth that will not fade. His soldiers, scattered across continents, carry his legend home. They tell of a man who dreamed bigger than the earth itself, who crossed deserts as if chasing the horizon, who wept because there were no worlds left to conquer. In their memories, the fever that killed him becomes something poetic, a punishment from jealous gods rather than disease. By the time centuries pass, no one agrees on how he died, only that he changed the course of history. Kings will borrow his name, generals will chase his shadow, and cities will rise on the ruins he left behind. Alexander the Great may have fallen in Babylon, but the myth he created, brilliant, ruthless, and immortal, never truly stopped marching. The year is 48 BC. Egypt is divided not by foreign invaders, but by family. Cleopatra, the last daughter of the Ptolemaic dynasty, finds herself driven from Alexandria by her younger brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy XIII. The royal court has turned against her, a nest of scheming eunuchs and tutors who whisper poison into the boy king's ear. Cleopatra flees into the desert with only a handful of loyal followers, leaving behind the marble halls of the palace for a tent beneath the endless Egyptian stars. Meanwhile, far to the west, Julius Caesar arrives in Alexandria, not as a lover, but as a man of law, or at least Roman law. He's chasing the ghost of Pompey, his rival and former ally, who has fled to Egypt for safety. But when Caesar lands on Egyptian soil, he discovers a gruesome gift: Pompey's severed head presented by Ptolemy's courtiers in a misguided attempt to please Rome. Caesar is not amused. The boy king's gesture reeks of barbarity and bad politics. It's in this volatile moment that Cleopatra makes her move. She knows Egypt's throne is not won with armies, but with opportunity, wrapped in a carpet, or perhaps a linen sack, depending on which historian you trust. She has herself smuggled into Caesar's private chambers in the royal palace. When the rug unfurls, the conqueror of Gaul finds not an assassin, but a 21-year-old queen, disheveled from travel, yet radiant with confidence. Cleopatra speaks 7 languages. Caesar speaks power. Between them, words become weapons and admiration, a kind of treaty. She pleads her case, not as a helpless exile, but as a ruler wronged by treachery. Caesar listens, intrigued. He's 52, weary from decades of war. But in this Egyptian queen, he sees a reflection of his own ambition. Relentless, intelligent, and unafraid. By morning, alliances are forged in silk sheets and strategy. Cleopatra regains an ally in the most powerful man in the world, while Caesar gains access to Egypt's immense wealth and grain supply, a lifeline for Rome. What began as a political calculation soon ripens into something far more dangerous. A partnership that will scandalize empires and change the course of history. Caesar's arrival in Egypt was supposed to be a diplomatic errand. Instead, it became a war zone. The moment he declared Cleopatra the rightful ruler, the palace erupted in chaos. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, especially the scheming Eunuchus and the general Achilles, saw Caesar's decision as foreign interference. To them, Cleopatra wasn't a queen restored. She was a Roman puppet, and if Egypt's throne was to be defended, Rome itself would have to be expelled. The city of Alexandria, once the jewel of the Mediterranean, turned into a battlefield. The narrow streets echoed with clashing steel, while smoke from burning ships clouded the harbor. Caesar found himself besieged inside the royal quarter, trapped between the Egyptian army and the restless citizens who had once cheered their queen. For all his military genius, Caesar had come to Egypt with barely 4,000 men, hardly enough to hold a city of 500,000. Cleopatra remained by his side, calm amidst the chaos. She wasn't merely a figure of beauty in distress. She was calculating, persuasive, and perfectly aware that her survival was tied to his. Together, they transformed the palace into a fortress. Cleopatra used her knowledge of the local terrain and politics to outmaneuver her brother's supporters. Caesar, always the tactician, set fire to the Egyptian fleet to prevent it from blocking his escape, an act that accidentally spread to the Great Library, sending thousands of papyrus scrolls up in flames. The siege dragged on for months. Food grew scarce, morale weaker. Yet Caesar refused to retreat. He sent desperate calls for reinforcements, all while enduring attacks from land and sea. Cleopatra kept his resolve intact, offering both counsel and comfort. Historians later romanticized their partnership, but in truth it was forged under the sound of catapults and the stench of burning tar. Then salvation arrived. Roman reinforcements under Mithrates of Pergamon broke through the Egyptian lines. The tide turned swiftly. Ptolemy XIII's forces fled, and the young king himself drowned in the Nile, weighed down by his golden armor. A fitting end for a child monarch undone by pride and politics. As smoke cleared over Alexandria, Cleopatra emerged victorious, not just as Queen of Egypt, but as the woman who had tamed both a civil war and the most powerful general in the world, with her brother dead and Caesar's legions in command. Cleopatra finally reclaimed the throne that had been stolen from her. But victory in Egypt was never permanent. especially for a queen ruling under the watchful eye of Rome. To secure her legitimacy, Cleopatra followed Stoic custom and married her surviving younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, a boy barely in his teens. It was a political formality, the kind of ceremony performed for tradition's sake, while the real power sat beside her, Julius Caesar. Alexandria was soon transformed from a war-torn city into a stage of spectacle and revival. Cleopatra ruled from the palace on the Mediterranean shore, resplendent in gold and lapis lazuli, while Caesar remained as her guest, or perhaps her captive by affection. The two ruled side by side, their every public appearance a careful performance of unity between Egypt and Rome. For the Alexandrians, she was Isis reborn, radiant and divine. For Caesar, she was proof that diplomacy could be seductive. Cleopatra's intelligence and charm left even hardened Roman officers in awe. She could disarm a council of generals as easily as she could quote philosophy. Caesar, who had spent his life surrounded by political games, found in her a partner who understood the stakes. Not just a lover, but an equal in ambition. The alliance was pragmatic at first, but the line between strategy and passion blurred quickly. Then came the news that changed everything. Cleopatra was pregnant. The announcement electrified Alexandria and horrified Rome. Caesar was already married, and no Roman law permitted marriage to a foreign monarch. Yet in the palace gardens, Cleopatra glowed with triumph. The child she carried, later known as Caesarion, would be the living symbol of their union, a bridge between empires, or perhaps a fuse waiting to ignite them. While the courtiers whispered, Cleopatra began planning for the future. She strengthened Egypt's economy, reformed taxes, and restored temples left in ruin. To the common people, she was a goddess of prosperity. To Caesar, she was both temptation and political problem. Their relationship, already scandalous, had produced something dangerous, an air that could unite two worlds or plunge them both into chaos. And for the first time, Caesar began to realize that Cleopatra's love came with an empire attached. In 47 B.C., Julius Caesar finally prepared to return to Rome. The civil war still raged, and Mark Antony, his loyal lieutenant, needed him. Yet, he did not leave alone. Cleopatra, now mother to his newborn son, Caesarion, accompanied him down the Nile on what became one of history's most extravagant river journeys. The royal barge shimmered with purple sails. Musicians played from the decks, and servants rode to the rhythm of flutes. The voyage was half celebration, half declaration. Egypt was reborn under its queen, and she had Rome's champion at her side. For a few precious months, they traveled together through temples and ancient tombs, the living symbols of a new divine pairing. Caesar as Dionysus, Cleopatra as Isis. But Rome was never far from Caesar's mind. He left Egypt reluctantly, promising to send for her later. Cleopatra, ever pragmatic, understood that love alone would not protect her or her child. She had to bind Egypt's fate to Rome's ambition. When Caesar returned to Rome, rumors preceded him. The Senate whispered that he had gone soft in Alexandria, that Cleopatra had bewitched him. They mocked her as the Eastern witch and called him her puppet. Caesar ignored them all. He had bigger plans to reshape Rome into a monarchy under his sole command. Yet in private, he sent for Cleopatra. Against all advice, she arrived in Rome with her infant son and an entourage that dazzled even the cynical Romans. Her arrival caused scandal. No foreign queen had ever been hosted in the capital with such honors. Caesar lodged her in his villa across the Tiber within sight of the city, as if daring the Senate to protest. Cleopatra walked the streets with confidence, adorned in gold and Egyptian linen, a living challenge to Roman modesty. The people gawked, half fascinated, half offended. For Cleopatra, Rome was enemy territory dressed in marble. She spoke cautiously, observed everything, and charmed those who mattered, senators, philosophers, even Caesar's allies. Yet she knew she was walking on the edge of a blade. Caesar's affection protected her for now, but envy was already brewing in the marble halls of power. Behind the admiration and ceremony, daggers were being sharpened. Cleopatra had conquered Caesar's heart, but Rome's was another matter entirely. Cleopatra's stay in Rome was less a visit and more a spectacle. a living test of how much Caesar could bend the Republic before it snapped. The city had never seen anything like her. Draped in Egyptian linen, wearing jewels that caught the Italian sun, she arrived at public events with the poise of a goddess and the confidence of a conqueror. To the Romans, she was exotic, dangerous, and fascinating, the embodiment of a foreign power that had seduced their most powerful man. Caesar placed a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the Roman goddess from whom he claimed descent. The message was clear and scandalous. Cleopatra was no mere guest. She was divine, perhaps even kin to Rome's own gods. Senators seethed. To them, this was blasphemy, not worship, but humiliation. A foreign queen worshipped beside Venus was proof that Caesar had lost his Roman sense of restraint. In the shadows of admiration lurked resentment. The Roman elite whispered that Cleopatra's influence was growing, that she urged Caesar to crown himself king, that she sought to replace the Republic with an empire ruled from Alexandria. Whether any of this was true hardly mattered. Perception in Rome was poison, and Cleopatra's presence provided plenty of it. Still, Caesar seemed unmoved. He continued his reforms, rewrote calendars, and planned vast building projects. He even renamed a month, July, in his own honor. And whenever he retreated to his villa across the Tiber, Cleopatra and their son were waiting. Caesarian, golden-haired and curious, was proof of a bond that defied politics. Caesar never publicly acknowledged the boy as his heir, but everyone knew whose child he was. Cleopatra played her role carefully. She flattered senators, attended festivals, and presented herself as both queen and intellectual. In private, she observed the Republic's slow collapse, a theater of ambition, where every smile hit a dagger. She understood Rome better than most Romans did. It was a place where love was never just love, and alliances were written in blood. When omens began to appear, strange lights in the sky, prophetic warnings, Caesar laughed them off. Cleopatra did not. She had seen enough courts fall to know what envy and fear could do to powerful men. Rome, she sensed, was holding its breath, and not in admiration. By 44 B to CE, Julius Caesar stood at the height of his power and on the edge of a knife. He had been declared dictator perpetual, dictator for life, an honor that sounded more like a curse to Rome senators. Statues of him rose in the Forum. His image appeared on coins. To Romans who still clung to the illusion of the Republic, it was blasphemy. To them, Caesar had become what every Roman feared most. A king, Cleopatra watched the unfolding drama from her villa across the Tiber. She saw the shifting glances, the tense silences in the Senate. Her instincts, sharpened by years of palace intrigue, told her what Caesar refused to see. Power never rests unchallenged. She urged him to be cautious, to trust no one. But Caesar was too confident. He had survived battles, mutinies, and assassins before. In his mind, destiny was his ally. The omens grew darker. A seer warned him to beware the Ides of March. His wife, Calpurnia, dreamed of his death and begged him not to attend the Senate that day. Cleopatra's own priests, interpreting the stars, foresaw blood upon the eagle's seat. But Caesar laughed. Cowards die many times before their deaths, he said, brushing off the warnings. On the morning of the 15th, he entered the theater of Pompey, the irony of the location lost on no one. It was beneath the statue of his old rival that his fate awaited. Surrounded by men he considered allies, Caesar took his seat. Then came the first dagger, and another, then 20 more. When he finally saw Brutus among them, the man he trusted like a son, his strength faltered. "It too, Brute," he whispered, or so legend claims, before collapsing at the base of Pompey's statue. In a single moment, Rome's most powerful man became a lifeless body on a marble floor. Outside, the city trembled. Rumors flew across the Tiber like smoke. Caesar is dead. Cleopatra, hearing the news, locked herself in her quarters with Caesarion, her mind already racing. Love and politics had always been intertwined, and now both had drawn blood. For Rome, it was the end of a dictator. For Cleopatra, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Panic swept through Rome like wildfire. The Senate that had slain Caesar thought it had saved the Republic. Instead, it had unleashed chaos. Crowds filled the streets, demanding vengeance. Soldiers loyal to Caesar's memory prowled the forum, chanting his name. Bonfires burned late into the night, as if the city itself were trying to purge its guilt. Amid the confusion, Cleopatra knew one truth. Rome was no longer safe. She had arrived as a guest of the most powerful man in the world. Now she was the lover of a murdered tyrant the foreign queen blamed for his downfall. The whispers began almost immediately that she had bewitched Caesar, that her influence had driven him toward monarchy, that the daggers had been meant as much for her as for him. Rome, which had once admired her exotic charm, now spat her name like a curse. Cleopatra's villa across the Tiber became a fortress of fear. Servants fled. Roman officials avoided her. Messengers arrived with conflicting news. Caesar's body had been burned in the Forum. His friend Mark Antony had seized control of the army. The assassins had fled the city. Cleopatra waited, calculating her next move. She had seen how quickly love turned to ruin, and Egypt, her Egypt, could not be left undefended. One night, under a moonless sky, she slipped away. Her ships, waiting quietly at Ostia, sailed before dawn. The voyage home was silent and tense. Each creak of the deck seemed to echo with memories. Laughter shared with Caesar, the cries of Rome on fire, the faint murmur of her child sleeping below deck. Caesar Ion was her last link to him, and perhaps her greatest danger. If Rome learned of his parentage, the boy could become both a prize and a target. When Alexandria's lighthouse appeared on the horizon, Cleopatra exhaled for the first time in weeks. The city shimmered under the Egyptian sun, familiar and treacherous all at once. She had returned a widow of empire, carrying not only a child, but a legacy soaked in Roman blood. In the marble halls of her palace, she swore a quiet oath. Caesar might be dead, but through Caesar Ion, his line and her ambition would live. Rome had slain her lover, but it had not seen the last of his queen. In the power vacuum left by Caesar's assassination, Rome tore itself apart once again. Senators fled, armies switched loyalties, and the Republic bled in the streets. Out of this chaos rose a familiar face. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and friend. Charismatic, ambitious, and dangerously impulsive, Antony seized the moment. He spoke to the people as Caesar once had, turning grief into fury. Soon he stood as Rome's new strongman, balancing on a knife's edge between statesman and demagogue. Cleopatra watched from Alexandria with cautious fascination. She knew Antony well by reputation, a man of appetite, equally drawn to power and pleasure. Unlike the cold, calculating Caesar, Antony ruled through emotion. He drank heavily, loved theatrically, and fought with the energy of a man trying to outlive his own vices. Yet beneath his recklessness, Cleopatra recognized something else. Opportunity. Rome's fragile balance fractured again when Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, challenged Antony's authority. The two men entered into a tense alliance, each pretending to serve the Republic while plotting its final destruction. In this dance of ambition, Egypt became essential once more. Antony needed ships, money, and grain. Cleopatra had all three and a keen understanding of how to make a Roman kneel. In 41 B.C., Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus to answer accusations that she had betrayed Rome during the civil wars. Most rulers would have gone trembling. Cleopatra arrived as a goddess. Her golden barge sailed up the Cydnus River with purple sails billowing in the wind, silver oars flashing in the sunlight. Incense drifted across the water. Attendants dressed as cupids fanned her throne. Antony, waiting on the shore, found himself watching a legend come to life. When Cleopatra stepped ashore, she didn't bow. She greeted Antony as an equal, a performance both political and personal. Within days, he was captivated. The meeting that was supposed to be an interrogation became a coronation of desire. Cleopatra knew exactly what she was doing. She had traded one Roman general for another, but this time she would be the one setting the terms. As Antony followed her back to Alexandria, the pattern of history repeated itself. Empire bending toward the will of a woman who ruled not only with beauty, but with strategy sharper than any sword in Rome. When Mark Antony entered Alexandria at Cleopatra's side, it felt like déjà vu. Another Roman swept up in Egypt's spell. But this time, Cleopatra was no young queen seeking survival. She was a seasoned ruler, sharper, wiser, and fully aware of the stakes. With Caesar gone, and Rome divided between Antony and Octavian, she saw her chance not just to preserve Egypt, but to shape the world once more. Their partnership quickly deepened into passion, and politics intertwined. Cleopatra hosted Antony in dazzling feasts, tables of gold, rivers of wine, and endless entertainment meant to remind him that Egypt could offer what Rome never could: grandeur without restraint. They called themselves the inimitable lovers who lived like gods. Yet beneath the laughter, the stakes were deadly serious. Cleopatra needed a protector. Antony needed her wealth to fund his campaign against Parthia. Each pretended it was love. Each knew it was power. In the years that followed, Cleopatra bore him 3 children: twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a son, Ptolemy Philadelphia. To her people, she was Isis incarnate. To the Romans, she was once again the dangerous enchantress who had corrupted another of their heroes. The Senate fumed when Antony granted eastern lands to Cleopatra and their children. Rome saw betrayal. Antony saw destiny. An empire reborn ruled from Alexandria rather than the Tiber. But the myth of Caesar and Cleopatra still lingered, haunting them both. Octavian, Caesar's heir, understood how to weaponize it. He painted Antony as a man enslaved by a foreign queen, declaring that Cleopatra sought to make Rome her servant. It was a lie, but a useful one. The image of the proud Roman general bowing to an Egyptian temptress was enough to ignite war. When the final conflict came, the Battle of Actium, it would destroy them both. But that is another story, one that ends in tragedy and immortality. For now, as the sun set over the Nile, Cleopatra stood on her palace balcony, her children sleeping and Antony laughing below. She had loved 2 Romans and outlived both in legend. Their empires would fade, but her myth, the Queen of Kings, the woman who ensnared Rome itself, would never die. In ancient Egypt, death was not the end. It was the beginning of eternity. Life on earth was seen as a fleeting test, a brief rehearsal for the great voyage to the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that when a person died, their soul, the car, left the body, but still needed a physical form to return to. Without preservation, the car would wander aimlessly, lost between worlds. Thus began one of humanity's most astonishing rituals: mummification, a sacred craft that transformed the dead into divine beings. The moment death was declared, the 70-day countdown began. The family summoned a team of specialized priests known as the Servants of Anubis. These men were not ordinary morticians. They were guardians of cosmic order, repeating the same rites perfected over thousands of years. Before touching the body, they performed purification rituals, washing themselves in sacred water, burning incense, and reciting hymns to Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming. The deceased's name was whispered over the body to reawaken spiritual recognition. Every motion from this point carried meaning. Nothing was done by chance. The priests worked in silence, except for the steady rhythm of chants. The workshop, known as the Wabbit, was filled with the scent of resins and natron salts. A painted effigy of Anubis stood nearby, its gaze fixed upon the proceedings, as if ensuring no mistake was made. The embalmer began by laying the body on a slanted stone table, washing it with palm wine and water from the Nile. This was both physical and spiritual cleansing. The Nile's waters symbolized rebirth. Offerings of bread, beer, and perfume were placed at the head of the deceased to nourish the spirit during the long transformation ahead. The extracted organs were not discarded. They were placed in 4 beautifully carved canopic jars, each guarded by one of the sons of Horus, deities who watched over the organs in the afterlife. The jackal-headed Duamph protected the stomach. The falcon-headed Kavuf guarded the intestines. Happy with the head of a baboon watched over the lungs, and Ameti with a human face guarded the liver. These jars were placed beside the coffin as vital companions to the deceased. Once the cavity was emptied, the priests washed it again with aromatic resins and stuffed it with bundles of clean linen, sawdust, and spices, cinnamon, cassia, and MYRR to restore shape and scent. Then the body was sewn shut, the cut concealed beneath wax and resin. In that silent chamber, the priests had not just dissected flesh. They had restructured the human form into a vessel worthy of eternity. With the organs removed and the body cleansed, the next stage of the journey began, the drying. This was the longest and most crucial phase of mummification, lasting 40 full days. The goal was simple but divine: to remove every trace of moisture, every sign of mortality. For the Egyptians, decay was chaos, and chaos had no place in the order of eternity. The priests carried the body to a slanted stone table inside a cool, dry chamber. There they surrounded it with natron, a natural salt harvested from Egypt's desert lakes. This mixture of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate was seen as a gift from the gods, capable of drawing out the corrupting forces of the earth. The body was completely buried in it, covered head to toe like a seed planted in sacred sand. Days turned into weeks. The desert air worked in harmony with the natron's power, slowly pulling the moisture from flesh and bone. Inside the chamber, the silence was absolute. No prayers, no movement, only time doing its invisible work. The priests visited occasionally to inspect the progress, offering incense and chanting hymns to Anubis, thanking him for protecting the body during its transformation. Meanwhile, the family waited outside, observing the 40-day vigil. They brought offerings, bread, beer, oils, and flowers to ensure the soul's peace during this liminal state. The deceased was believed to hover between worlds, neither alive nor dead, suspended in divine preparation. When the time came to lift the body from its salty tomb, what emerged was astonishing. The flesh had darkened and tightened, the features preserved in uncanny clarity. Fingers, lips, even eyelashes often remained intact, a human form frozen in time. The priests gently brushed off the remaining matron and washed the body once more in fragrant oils, restoring suppleness to the skin. This moment marked the first true glimpse of eternity. The person lying on the table no longer belonged to the realm of the living, but to the gods. The priests anointed the body with sacred resins, sealing it from decay and perfuming it for its celestial voyage. 40 days had passed, but in Egyptian belief, so had mortality. The human body, once frail and fleeting, had been refined into something divine, the eternal vessel of the soul. After 40 days of drying in matron, the body was no longer flesh, but form, a vessel hardened and purified, ready to receive divine life once more. Now began the stage of restoration when the priests of Anubis reassembled the body, restoring its dignity and preparing it to be recognized by the gods in the afterlife. The embalmed gathered around the table, their hands dipped in fragrant oils, cedar, myrrh, frankincense, and lotus. Each oil served a ritual purpose. Some softened the skin, others warded off decay, but all carried spiritual significance. As they anointed the limbs, they recited invocations to Osiris, Lord of the Dead, and to Hathor, goddess of beauty and rebirth. The body was not merely preserved, it was reawakened. Every finger and toe was wrapped separately in fine linen, soaked in resin. The priests whispered the name of the deceased with each binding, ensuring that no part of the person's identity would be lost. Amulets were placed between the layers, small charms carved from gold fence or lapis lazuli. Each symbol served a protective role: the scarab to renew life, the eye of Horus to grant healing, the ankh to ensure resurrection. The heart amulet, shaped like a sacred beetle, was placed carefully over the chest. It was the most important charm of all, for it protected the heart during the weighing of the soul in the Hall of Mart. According to belief, if the heart betrayed the deceased by speaking of their sins, this amulet would silence it, ensuring safe passage to eternal peace. Next, the priests stuffed the body cavity with resins and perfumed linen to restore its shape and fragrance. The limbs were adjusted, the mouth slightly opened, symbolically allowing the soul to breathe again. Then the chief embalmer, masked as Anubis, touched the forehead with his bronze tool, blessing the body with words known as the ritual of transformation. By the time the anointing was complete, the once human figure had become divine. The scent of oils filled the chamber like incense from the heavens. To the priests, this was the moment of rebirth. The soul's return to its purified temple. The mortal had been reshaped into something eternal, a body now worthy of being called the house of a god. The wrapping was the most sacred and symbolically charged stage of mummification, a ritual that transformed the body from a mortal shell into an eternal being. The priests approached it as both ceremony and craft, moving with rhythmic precision, guided by prayers older than the pyramids themselves. The body, now cleansed and anointed, was placed upon a long wooden board. Linen strips, sometimes hundreds of meters long, were prepared from the finest flax. Each bandage was purified with incense and oils before touching the skin. The process could take 15 full days, not because it was slow, but because it was sacred. Every layer was a spell, every knot a prayer. The wrapping began with the fingers and toes, each digit encased separately to preserve the individual's physical identity. Then came the hands, feet, and limbs. The priest spoke the deceased's name during every turn of cloth, ensuring the spirit would remember itself. As the layers grew thicker, amulets were inserted between them over the heart, the throat, and the abdomen, each one carrying protection for a specific danger in the afterlife. At the chest, a large scarab amulet was placed, inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead. Its purpose was profound. It silenced the heart during divine judgment, preventing guilt from condemning the soul. Over the throat, the priests laid an amulet of the Jed pillar, the symbol of Osiris, to ensure stability and resurrection. Every placement followed cosmic logic, a map of eternity stitched into linen. Once the torso and limbs were sealed, the head received special attention. The face was wrapped gently, layer upon layer, leaving the features smooth and serene. Resin was brushed across the surface to harden the wrappings and bind them into one body, unified, eternal. The final bandages were arranged in intricate diamond patterns, creating the recognizable form of the Egyptian mummy. A golden mask, or painted cartonnage for those of lesser rank, was placed over the face, representing the divine image the deceased would wear forever. When the priest stepped back, the human was gone. In its place lay a godlike figure, silent, radiant, and eternal. The wrapping was complete, but the spirit's journey was only just beginning. The body now waited to be awakened by the sacred opening of the mouth ceremony, the final step before rebirth. The wrapping was complete, but the mummy, though flawless, was still lifeless, a sacred shell awaiting animation. To the Egyptians, preservation meant nothing without reawakening. The opening of the mouth ceremony was the most profound ritual in the entire process, for it restored the senses of the deceased and reconnected body and soul. Only after this rite could the spirit eat, speak, see, and breathe in the afterlife. At dawn, the priests gathered before the wrapped body, which was now resting upright or laid within a decorated coffin. The chief officiant, often wearing the mask of Anubis, stood before it, holding a sacred instrument known as the peshkef. Shaped like a small blade or chisel, it was modeled after the tool used in childbirth, symbolizing a second birth, the rebirth into eternity. The ceremony began with purifications. Incense burned thick in the air, the scent of myrrh and frankincense mingling with chants to Osiris and Horus. Offerings of bread, beer, and milk were laid out before the mummy, representing the sustenance of life. The priests sprinkled holy water and drew circles in the sand to mark the boundaries between worlds. Then came the rite itself. The pesk was touched to the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the mummy. Each touch was accompanied by a declaration. May your mouth open to speak the words of truth. May your eyes open to see the light of Ra. May your nostrils open to breathe the air of life. The body, long silent and sealed, was symbolically revived. In that moment, the mummy was no longer an object. It was a person again, ready to walk into the afterlife as an immortal being. The ritual concluded with the offering of food and drink, which the newly awakened spirit was believed to consume on a spiritual level. For the Egyptians, this act was not metaphorical. It was real. The opening of the mouth transformed death into continuity, silence into speech, stone into life. It was both farewell and promise that the person's soul would live on, free to speak their name before the gods. And in Egypt, to speak one's name was to live forever. With the opening of the mouth complete, the body had been reborn. Yet one last step remained before the journey to the afterlife could begin. The burial itself, a ceremony both grand and solemn. For the ancient Egyptians, this was not merely the disposal of remains. It was the sacred delivery of a soul into eternity. The procession began at sunrise. Priests, mourners, and family members walked through the desert toward the tomb, carrying the mummy in a gilded coffin. The coffin itself was a work of devotion, painted with hieroglyphic spells, adorned with protective deities, and aligned with the stars. Beneath its surface, every symbol whispered of resurrection: the wings of Isis, the eye of Horus, the anchor of life. Musicians played mournful flutes, while women, often hired professional mourners, wailed to echo the cries of the goddess Isis mourning her husband Osiris. Before the tomb, the priests halted to perform the final purifications. The coffin was lowered to the ground while incense burned, and water from the Nile was sprinkled in blessing. Offerings of bread, beer, onions, and wine were presented to sustain the soul on its long voyage. Each offering was accompanied by a recited spell from the Book of the Dead, ensuring that no hunger, thirst, or harm would plague the spirit in the afterlife. Inside the tomb, the burial chamber awaited, walls painted with vivid scenes of paradise, the soul sailing with Ra across the heavens, hunting in green fields, and greeting long-lost ancestors. The Coptic jars were placed beside the coffin along with amulets, statues, and personal belongings. Everything from combs to jewelry to writing palettes. Even servants made of carved clay, called ushabti, were included to serve the deceased in eternity. As the final act, the coffin was gently lowered into the sarcophagus. The priests sealed the chamber with stone, reciting the words, "May your soul live forever in the field of reeds." The mourners turned away, leaving offerings at the entrance as the tomb was closed for eternity. When silence returned to the desert, only the wind remained, carrying prayers across the sands. Deep within the tomb, the preserved body rested in stillness, awaiting its next awakening under the eternal sun of Ra. Death was never the end for an ancient Egyptian. It was the beginning of the soul's greatest journey. Once the tomb was sealed, the Kar, life force, and Ba, the personality or spirit, began their passage through the unseen world. Guided by spells from the Book of the Dead, written on the tomb walls and on papyrus scrolls, the deceased ventured into the Duat, the vast shadowy realm of the afterlife. The journey was perilous. The Ba, often depicted as a human-headed bird, had to navigate caverns filled with serpents, fire lakes, and monstrous guardians who demanded secret names and passwords. Every trial mirrored moral truth, a reflection of how the person had lived. The heart, still resting inside the mummified chest, remembered all deeds, both noble and shameful. Eventually, the soul reached the Hall of Mat, the place of divine judgment. There, before the 42 gods, Anubis weighed the heart on a golden scale against the feather of Mat, the symbol of truth and cosmic balance. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, recorded the result. If the heart was light, it meant the person had lived with integrity. If heavy with sin, it was cast to Amit, the devourer, part lion, crocodile, and hippopotamus, who would consume it, ending the soul forever. For those who passed the test, Osiris himself, the resurrected god of the underworld, welcomed them. "You are justified," he declared. The soul then transformed into an AK, a perfected spirit of light. Freed from the trials of mortality, it sailed across the sky with the sun god Ra, watching dawn and dusk forever. In Egyptian belief, this was the ultimate victory, not to escape death, but to master it. The preserved body in the tomb ensured the Kar could return whenever it wished, resting in comfort among the offerings of food, drink, and incense left by family. The soul, meanwhile, roamed freely between earth and the heavens. Through ritual, prayer, and craftsmanship, the Egyptians had turned death into art, the art of becoming eternal. To them, immortality was not a dream. It was a skill learned and perfected layer by sacred layer beneath the burning sun of Egypt.